skill number 9, video number 2. If we sort of extend the gear ratio stuff that we were doing in the last video, we can do some of these calculations for what we call cluster gear transmission. So that's sort of multiple gear pairs that are kind of used in sequence. That there is a pretty decent drawing that goes with it. So the sort of basics, sort of the mechanics here, right, is you have the same picture we were just using, your input gear 1, right? So you have your driving gear versus then your driven gear. So this is sort of input. This is kind of output, right? Number 1. That's kind of input number 1. And then the idea is that that output is connected to another sequence of gears. So then this output is sort of spinning. You have your sort of RPMs then between these two are synced up. But then this becomes another input gear. So that's kind of input number 2, right? Driving number 2. And then it's connected to another driven gear. So then this is your sort of output number 2, right? So the idea is these all sort of work in a sequence, and you're then kind of increasing your sort of overall ratio by sort of having these all sort of work together. The gear ratio for this sequence, this cluster, is essentially just the product of the two individual gear ratios. So our sort of gear ratio here, one way of putting it is you would say output 1 over input 1, right? That's gear ratio sort of number 1 versus then output 2 over input 2, right? These sort of pairs, individual pairs, have individual ratios. And so you get kind of individual gear ratios that you're really just multiplying together. The book kind of visualizes this in a particular way, right? You can sort of have them from here. If you're multiplying, you could obviously sort of do output times output over input times input, which is essentially what the sort of setup is here. Or you can kind of visualize it this way. This is multiplication, times here and times here, and then you kind of get your setup. So let me sort of run you through an example. This, again, the math here, right? The setup here is, the calculations are nothing really too wild. It's more about just kind of making sure you have all your pieces in the right place more than anything else. It's kind of about getting everything kind of labeled correctly and just sort of fitting it all together. So say we have this particular setup, right? So we have another sort of visual. So I've got sort of input, right? So input 1 is 13, output 1 is 47. These are sort of the teeth, right? 13 teeth to 47 teeth. And then it's connected to, so this would be, right, kind of input 2 and output 2. Do input 1 and output 1 here, right? So my two ratios are just going to be the output over the input times the output over the input. We can sort of set it up with this kind of box setup. In theory, right, these are just your individual ratios. It's really just multiplying these two pairs, right? There's not really a lot. These are pretty random numbers. It's not like we're necessarily looking to sort of cancel any common factors out or anything like that. And we're talking calculator style, so we're fine to just sort of multiply across, which would be this 2632 over 11 times 13, 143. And then if we do that division, you're going to end up with this 18.4. So the ratio, the overall ratio here, right, where you're sort of stacking these two gears on top of each other, right, or these two gear sequences on top of each other, would be 18.4 to 1, right? So you're kind of getting a bigger ratio there when you're sort of stacking these two versus what you would get from just sort of each of these individually. Thinking about having a gear that was, almost 20 times bigger than the other one, right? That size difference is extremely big, is a little bit impractical. But if you can kind of stack them, then you can sort of get a bigger spread by having these in sequence. If we look at one from same problem, right? Same kind of setup, but just how they look in the examples. So, right, you can kind of use the diagram there as a reference, but we're also just sort of given this information, right? So driving versus driven, 1 and 2, driving versus driven, right, just 1 and then 2. So we have our different sort of teeth here. Taking this information then and kind of rewritten it, right? So the connection here is, right, input gears are your driving gears, output gears are your driven gears. So driving to driven, right? So input and output for the sequence 1 is 16 to 27. Input to output for sequence 2 is 13 to 34, right? So my overall ratio is just going to be those two ratios just sort of stacked and set up. So this is just a matter of getting all these numbers in order. So 27 and 16 are a pair, right? Output 1 and input 1 times output 2 and input 2. So that's 34 versus 13. So I'm not really going to do anything fancy here. I'm just going to multiply these values out. We'll just go the 2 up top. 27 times 34 is 918 over 16 times 13, 208. So if I go 918 divide by 208, 4.41, we'll call that 4.4, I suppose. Which means my gear ratio, right? Again, always writing these as a ratio, 4.4 to 1. This is a less extreme example, but you can kind of see the initial gear sizes here are not super far apart. 16 and 27 in particular it's not even really getting doubled in that sense. So this is a smaller sort of span than the one that we had from our example 9.2 in the book. That's the basics of it. So these cluster gears, right? Sort of these just sequences of gear pairs. You're kind of just like stacking them on top of each other and going from there. There's a couple other examples in this section, 9.3 and 9.4. I'm sort of skipping from this video. They're not anything I've assigned. If you'd like to look through them, it's good stuff. It sort of goes back and relates some of these values to torque, which is cool, but we're trying to do skill number 9 a little bit faster, so I'm skipping a couple of the things from the end. We're doing sort of the first part of it. So there you go, skill number 9. That also brings us to the end of chapter 2. Chapter 2 is short, just these 3 skills, 7, 8, and 9, this variation stuff. So nice work. You made it to the end of the second chapter.